ultimately, I want to make the point that in such a world, growth and equality are not only, they're not substitutes, they are strong complements.
So welcome to the 30th Kuznets Memorial Lecture presented by the Economic Growth Center. I'm Rohini Pandey. I'm a professor at the Economics Department and director of EGC. The Kuznets Lecture is an annual lecture on issues in economic development given by a prominent economist in memory of Simon Kuznets, the famous Belarusian-American economist. Kuznets was not a Yale professor, but he was instrumental in founding EGC. In 1934, Kuznets helped launch the US National Income Statistics Series. The motivation was to use data for policy. The series was issued to meet the need to describe consistently and in detail the economic toll taken by the Great Depression. Post-World War II, as colonialism ebbed, the big question was what would drive economic development in the poorer parts of the world. Kuznets saw a reason for a center to do something that his home institution were not able to do, to use data to describe development. And so he turned to Yale to set up the institute, which is now known as EGC. EGC was arguably the first development research center in a major US university that focused on using quantitative methods to understand economic development. Today, as we gain access to greater data and improve computational power and estimation methods, economists are responding to Kuznets' call of 1934, which was to say the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income alone, to look at broader measures of inequality. This broadening focus of development research will be the theme of Professor Goldberg's lecture tonight and of the conference that she will lead tomorrow. When it comes to bridging inequalities based on gender, it takes bold women to be willing to be the first to enter spaces previously held by men. Penny Goldberg is one such woman. She was the first female professor to be given tenure by the Yale Economic Department. She was the first female editor-in-chief of the American Economic Review. And as president-elect of the Econometric Society for 2021, she will be its first female president. More recently, Penny served as only the second ever female chief economist of the World Bank after Anne Kruger, who also happened to be the only other woman to have delivered the Kuznets Lecture in its 30-year history. Penny's research takes on important questions in trade and development. She studied large trade liberalization episodes in developing countries. Her work has drawn out the contrasting implications of trade reform in India and Latin America for product markets and inequality. Her most recent research examines the resurgence of protectionism in the US and the interplay between informality and trade liberalization. Penny is someone whose work I've admired for a long time, and she has been an important role model for me and many other women in the profession. So this year, as Yale celebrates the 50th anniversary of the matriculation of women in Yale College and the 150th anniversary of the first women students in the university, it seems particularly appropriate that we welcome this pioneering woman to deliver the 30th Kuznets Memorial Lecture. Please welcome Professor Goldberg.
Hello. First of all, Rohini, thank you so much for this very generous introduction. I'm very happy to be back for good now. Yale has been a wonderful home to me for many years, and I'm looking forward to assuming back my academic duties. But today I'm going to talk still as chief economist of the World Bank Group. I have 3 more days on my term. And the reason I mention that is not because there's going to be any juicy gossip. If that's what you're here for, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. But because when picking the topic for this lecture, I did try to be consistent with the theme of Kuznets' research, which, as Rohini mentioned, was very much focused on inequality and growth. But also I wanted to build on my World Bank experience for the past 2 years. So I'm going to draw on this. And what this means is I will start with some preliminary thoughts about the perspective that one has from the chief economist's office of the World Bank. What I mean by that, so one advantage of being at the World Bank is that one gets exposed to what I would call the big picture questions in economics. And for the past few years, there has been a tendency to focus on smaller questions, at least in research in economics, questions that we can address very well, but the scope of them tends to be more narrow. Perhaps many of you have seen a very well-known lecture by one of the Nobel Prize winners this year, Esther Duflo, She gave the Ely Lecture a few years ago, and the title of the Ely Lecture was The Economist as a Plumber. And there she made the point that it's very important for economists to get the details of implementation, of policy implementation right, because it doesn't matter how good your policy is, if you don't get the details right, the policy is going to come to nothing. And I love this lecture. I very much believe in this message, and after being at the World Bank for a year and a half, I believe in this message even more strongly than before. That said, I think one should not forget that in order to build a functional building, you need the plumber, but you also need the architect and the engineer. And as much as I believe that some of us should spend time on implementation and plumbing, I also think some of us should also spend some time on the big picture questions in economics and trying to figure out how everything fits together. And when you're in the World Bank, you are forced to do that all the time, partly because you interact with countries, with finance ministers, with policymakers, and they really want more from you than how a specific project will work. They will want to know what your vision for development is. Which brings me to one of the motivations of this lecture. I'm going to make the point that we're at a point in time where we need a new vision, a new model for development. I will explain what I mean in a moment. So I think that was one very positive aspect of being at the World Bank. You're forced to think about these questions. The other thing that's very different in the World Bank compared to academia is that you are constantly forced to think in cross-country terms. And as I'm sure you all know, cross-country regressions have become an anathema in empirical work in academics. You know, many people don't take them seriously anymore. But in the World Bank, this is often the foundation of giving advice to countries. So countries will often come to you and say, you are the World Bank, you've been to all these countries, you know what works in country A, can you tell us how we could apply it to our own country? So you are constantly forced to think in these cross-country terms, to run cross-country regressions in your head all the time. And I actually think that this is very productive. This is a good thing to do, as long as you understand the limitations of this and you don't confine yourself to a straitjacket of a regression and pretend that you have absolutely robust scientific evidence. So I mentioned that because what I'm going to talk about is going to build on these observations in some sense. I'm going to employ some cross-country analysis. And I'm going to rely a lot on correlations rather than clean identification, but I think some correlations can be actually quite informative. So I'll use, this is not going to be the standard academic talk. I'm going to use many pictures and correlations to just tell a story. So that's, as I said, I think there is a great demand among policymakers these days for a new vision for development, and I'll be more specific in a moment. At the same time, there is great demand, especially among advanced economies, among industrialized countries, for more equality or less inequality. So the focus of policy in many countries in the last few years has been on inequality, not on poverty. Poverty seems almost a forgotten word outside the World Bank. And whenever in the World Bank, in talks or seminars, I made a point for more equality, I immediately got pushback from countries, from poorer countries, that asked, does this mean you give up on growth? We don't care about inequality. For us, growth is much more important. And what underlies this comment is this very strongly held view among economists that there is a trade-off between growth and inequality. And of course, this trade-off is to a certain extent based on the famous Kuznets curve that posited that there is a trade-off, at least in the early stages of development, there is a trade-off between growth and inequality. As an economy grows, then inequality rises, but eventually it tapers off. So I will have something to say about that too. So with that introduction, let me give you a more specific roadmap for this talk. I will start by explaining what I mean by the old model of development that was based to a large extent on export-led industrialization. This is a model, perhaps it has been not that influential in academia, but it was the cornerstone of advice that the World Bank or the IMF and many other international institutions gave. Then I will talk about the recent retreat from globalization and multilateralism we've experienced in the last few years, and I will make the point that this retreat actually poses a challenge for this old model, and that also gives rise to this need for a new vision for development. And regarding this new vision, there are various proposals that are made fairly casually, actually, in the development world. One of them is leapfrogging into the service sector, skipping the manufacturing stage. Another one concerns urbanization-led development. And finally, what I really want to talk about today is the idea that if we transition to a world that's more closed, less open, with less trade, with less globalization, then domestic markets become more important. And if domestic markets become more important, then a certain degree of equality may become an important precondition for growth. So ultimately, I want to make the point that in such a world, growth and equality are not only, they're not substitutes, they are strong complements. So when I make this point, of course, it's the way I express it, it's very general and open-ended. So I will try to make it more concrete by operationalizing this notion of the domestic market. And to do that, that's when you need a conceptual framework. So I will talk a little bit about the theoretical framework that one can use to think about these issues, and then some empirical work that I've been recently working on and present some results. And eventually, as I said, the points I want to make, and this will be the conclusion in case you fall asleep or you have to leave early. For a small country, it's nearly impossible, if not completely impossible, to eliminate poverty if this country remains closed. So openness to trade is extremely important. So when we mean openness in that context, openness these days means more than trade. It means deep integration. So by deep integration, I mean essentially measures that make sure that whatever trade agreements you have are enforceable, but also measures that contribute to stronger capital and labor flows between countries. Alternatively, if you don't have this path that involves more openness, more trade, and if you need to focus on the domestic market, larger countries have it easier. If you're India, you're going to have an easier time growing because you can draw on the domestic market. But in such a setting, it's important to have a certain degree of equality that will support the emergence of a healthy middle class, so that the purchasing power of this middle class can support development. So this is where I'm going with this. And let me now be a little more specific. So as I said, I will start by explaining what the old model of export-led industrialization has been. What's this model? So this model is part of the so-called Washington Consensus, and these terms have become extremely controversial. But actually, if you think about what the Washington Consensus involved, it involved a set of many policies, many of which actually are fairly reasonable from an economist's point of view. Three of the most important pillars of this Washington Consensus were deregulation, privatization, and trade liberalization, so embracing open international markets. And the idea there was as follows. If we apply this model to developing countries are abundant in low-skilled labor, low-wage labor. So by engaging in free trade, in open trade, they can utilize their comparative advantage, and this comparative advantage can be most utilized in basic manufacturing. By exporting to higher income countries, a lot of good things happen. As I mentioned, they can utilize their comparative advantage. In addition, they can tap into the purchasing power of richer countries. If you were China in the 80s or Vietnam, in the early 90s, you don't need to rely on a rich domestic market to sell your products. You can rely on the richer consumers in the United States or Europe. You can realize economies of scale from selling to the global market and hence industrialize. And finally, you can use all the export revenue to finance investments in infrastructure or human capital, so investments that are going to give you the foundations for long-run development. And so this kind of model that has been applied to many countries, mostly in East Asia, is logically consistent. You can see how the various parts work. By the way, here I'm presenting a verbal feature of these models. International trade economists have spent many years building models that formalize these ideas. So the model has this beauty that it's logically consistent. It's a framework that we understand. You can disagree with it, but once you have the framework, you know how to attack it and how to take issue with some of these assumptions. But I would say overall, it has been actually supported by causal observation and evidence. And here I'm thinking, of course, mostly of what happened in East Asia and especially China. So let me give you, the story in a few pictures. And as I said, I'm going to rely here on correlations. So you're not going to see any regressions claiming identification. The modern era, so post-World War II, and this starts in 1827, okay? And on the vertical axis are exports, global exports as percentage of GDP. So you can see, there is some variations in this percentage over time. Here, that's 1945, and after 1945, so after World War II, exports start rising very fast. This is the period of what people call the hyperglobalization, when trade starts growing very fast as percentage of GDP. And this is partly powered by the emergence of global value chains and the emergence of fragmentation in production. So this is a global phenomenon. It's not driven by specific countries. So here you can see essentially the same picture. So here, fortunately, the numbers came out. And you can see it for the world as a whole. This is essentially the previous graph. But you can also see it for selected countries. And what's interesting here, I want to point out, is if you look at the USA, this is the blue line here, you see a trend upwards. But for the US, this trend is not that pronounced. And the reason, part of the reason is the US is already a very large, rich country. So trade is important for the US. But it's not as important for the US as it is for countries that are still poor. It's, of course, very important for China. This is China. And many people say hyperglobalization, the increase in trade is driven by China. China is clearly an important part of the story, but it's not just China. It's many other countries. For example, it's India. That's the green line here. Here I put some of the biggest countries. But you can see it also more clearly in this graph that shows the composition of world exports by income groups. And this is based on a classification that the World Bank uses. The World Bank makes the distinction between high-income countries and then between upper middle income, lower middle income, and low-income countries. And this classification here is based on 1987, so it's time invariant. So for example, China was a low-income country in 87. By now, it's upper middle income. But for the purpose of this graph, China will always appear in the low-income category. So you can see in 85, if we take countries other than the high-income countries, cumulatively they accounted for about 13% of total exports, world exports. And that makes sense. Most of the economic activity comes from the rich countries, as you would expect. So by 2015, if you take the cumulative share of upper middle income, lower middle income, and low-income countries is about 33%. So it has increased dramatically, and that part is driven to a very large extent by China. But again, it's not only China. Many other developing countries have participated in this phenomenon. Now, what has this done for poverty and for poverty across the world? At the same time, we had a very sharp reduction in global poverty and global inequality across the world. And of course, you're going to say that there are many factors that drove this decrease. It's not just trade, and perhaps the most important one was peace. You cannot have growth and prosperity and poverty reduction unless you have peace. And that's certainly true. But I will also make the point that trade has played an important role. And this is not something that you can show through a regression that is going to address all concerns you may have regarding identification. But I do think that if we take the evidence that has been accumulated over the years, and by that I mean regressions, I mean anecdotal evidence and anecdotal accounts, I mean the many case studies that actually my predecessor at the World Bank, Anne Kruger, conducted 30 years ago, mostly on East Asia and Southeast Asia, then all these studies together tell the story of trade contributing to growth and poverty reduction. Not to mention the recent experience, the relatively recent experience of China and Vietnam and Korea. And this story is also reflected in a series of books. So I will mention a few here. Deaton, The Great Escape. So this is a book that's extremely critical of the World Bank, and, but it does make the point that globalization has contributed very significantly to the Great Escape, and the Great Escape is the Great Escape from poverty. There is the World Bank report, World Development Report from 2006. And that report also made the point, the very important point at that time, that if we think about inequality, not within borders, but globally, about the difference, the discrepancy between the well-being of the globally rich and the globally poor, this has been dramatically reduced post-World War II. And one of the persons who worked on that World Development Report was actually Branko Milanovic, who after he left the World Bank, he actually worked on his book, Global Inequality. So the book that became a bestseller and made him truly famous. And that's, again, a book that makes this point that global inequality, by global inequality, you can, in some sense, you can take that as a synonym for poverty, has been reduced dramatically post-World War II. And again, globalization has played a very important role in all this. And that raises also the question, and that's actually a question that Branko Milanovic explicitly asks in his book, whether there is actually a trade-off between global inequality and within-country inequality. So one of his hypotheses is that this reduction in global inequality has happened at the expense of an increase in domestic inequality. Some more pictures that tell this story, and I think these are very telling. This is the very famous elephant curve. And this elephant, so the blue part comes from Branko, actually Branko Milanovic and Lackner. And you know, actually the green part was later added by Caroline Freund. And so what this elephant, so I will call this the old elephant curve because it has been updated, and I'll show you in a moment how. But what this elephant curve shows is on the horizontal axis, you have the percentiles of the global income distribution. So this is taking the world's population, putting it together, and then looking at the percentiles of this distribution. And then on the vertical axis, you have the income growth rate in percentage terms. This is per capita income. And you know, the striking, and this is all between 1988 and 2008. Okay, so this is precisely, this period includes precisely the period of the hyperglobalization. It is during this period where you see the fastest growth in these percentiles. These are actually the world's poor. So according to that figure, it's mostly the world's poor that have benefited the most from growth. Of course, the very rich also benefit a lot, so the very top 1%. But this is the main message of this curve was that poverty, that the growth was such that actually poverty declined, and it declined very sharply. Now, as I said, this curve was updated with very different data recently by a team of researchers, three of whom in that team include, you know, the famous trio, Saez, Piketty, and Zuckman of Berkeley. And the reason I mention that is because this curve uses different data. So it uses income tax data, so the same data they have used in their other work to demonstrate that it's the top 1% that has benefited the most from from recent economic changes. And this curve does not look like an elephant anymore. I mean, it looks more like a dragon, I think. But what it shows very clearly is that you have a disproportionate increase of well-being at the top 1%. So here, the growth incidence shows that it's the top 1% that captured a very large share of total growth. However, it also makes very clear the point that many have made, that it's the middle class in the US and Western Europe that gets squeezed. Okay, so these are the people who benefit the least. But still, you see that the really poor in the world still benefit from growth. So the message that the recent economic trends have benefited the poor, I think, remains still valid, even if you use this updated curve that paints a much less rosy picture about what growth does for the poor. And by the way, if you wonder what the source of the differences between the two curves are, there are many. In my view, the main issue is that this curve is based on tax data that capture the very top of the distribution. The other curve that I showed you is based on survey data, and there you always have the problem that the top incomes are not captured by these surveys. But again, my point here is that any way you put it, it's very hard to deny the message that poverty has very sharply declined. And this is also reflected in this picture here, which comes from World Bank estimates of poverty. So what this shows is what has happened to poverty, to the head count, to the poverty head count over time by different regions. And so first, if you look at the total, you see that the total has, we are here now, the total has declined, so the number of poor has declined. This is the projection, according to the World Bank, what is likely to happen by 2030. One interesting aspect of this graph is actually that it's broken down by different regions, and the classifications of the regions, again, reflects the World Bank classification. So there are some interesting patterns here. And one pattern is, let me point out, this part, the brown one, this is East Asia. In East Asia, you can see that poverty has been almost eliminated. This part that you can hardly see, reddish, is Europe and Central Asia. And again, in these parts of the world, poverty has been eliminated. By the way, I forgot to mention, poverty here is defined as living on less than $1.9 per day. So it's a very low bar for poverty. Okay, so these people are really the extremely poor. It's a very modest criterion, but nevertheless, even using this criterion, we see that if you look at a different region, if you look at Africa, this is the yellow part. Here, the picture is much less rosy. Not only has poverty not declined, poverty has increased in sub-Saharan Africa, and in fact, it's projected to increase even more. Okay? And the same actually applies to this part that, again, you can hardly see because the region is very small. This is MENA, so this is Middle East and North Africa. Again, poverty is increasing there. So poverty has declined in many parts of the world, but it remains very high in Africa and the Middle East, and in fact, there it's increasing. So this is, in terms of background of what has happened to poverty. Now, the second point I want to make is that I don't know if I have managed to convince you that globalization was part of the story. It's not the entire part. There are many other things that happened at the same time. But we do see the fastest poverty reductions in precisely those parts of the world that embraced openness. And again, East Asia comes immediately to mind, and especially China. But that said, is what we have experienced since 2008 is a slowdown in trade. So this slowdown started after the financial crisis. So during the financial crisis, trade collapsed completely. After the financial crisis, it started growing back, but again at a very slow pace, and it never quite gained its previous momentum. And some people have attributed this slowdown to a secular slowdown. What I mean by that is the following. So to a certain extent, trade was fueled by this emergence of global value chains. And you could have global value chains partly because it became technologically possible to fragment production. And many thought at some point fragmentation may have run its course. If you take a car, you can split it into parts and components, and you can trade those back and forth. But eventually, you run out of parts to split, right? You go down to the screws and the nuts and bolts. Eventually, there is no, you cannot fragment anymore. So there are some who thought this may be part of the story. And in fact, one thing you see is if you look at global value chains trade, so it peaked around 2010, and then it started going down as a percentage of trade. So again, with global value chain, this is the hyperglobalization. You see this very fast growth during that time. In my view, there is very little evidence to support this view. There is something else that has been going on, mostly in very recent years, so in the last 5 years. And this is the very strong policy backlash, so the backlash against globalization. And I think this presents a much more serious threat to trade and openness and globalization in general. So what do I mean by this? So first, there has been a revolt of the public in many developed primarily countries against free trade and immigration. And this is not specific to a particular country or to a particular party. We see it in the United States, but if there is one issue where there is bipartisan support for, is the opposition to free trade. You can be Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders, and they both advocate protectionism. Even more important than the tariffs and the return to protectionism has been what the US has been doing to the World Trade Organization. So the World Trade Organization is by now defunct due to the United States policies. In the UK, we have had Brexit, which again is a retreat from multilateralism. I already mentioned the World Trade Organization, the WTO. In addition, despite this generally held view that trade is free, there has been uneven liberalization of agricultural trade. Agricultural trade is still very protected, and this is something that's a very big issue for developing countries. The services trade remains highly restricted. And finally, they are rising behind what people call behind-the-border measures and other distortions. These are all on the rise. So if you take all this together, I think it's fair to say that there has been a retreat from globalization. And let me show you, again, in some pictures, what the trends are. So this shows what has happened to trade policy, not trade, between 1948 and 2016. And I often use this graph to make the point that despite this, again, broadly held view that the globalization has been mostly a technological phenomenon fueled by low communication and transportation costs, I want to make the point that trade policy has been important. One way you see that is by seeing what happened directly to tariffs. So these are applied tariffs in developing countries. So these tariffs have been going down. More importantly, if you look at membership in the World Trade Organization, so this membership has gone up steadily, and especially what was really important is that the World Trade Organization included many developing countries, and perhaps even more importantly, we've had many regional trade agreements. So these blue bars show the increase in regional trade agreements. So if you take all these measures together, lower tariffs, increased participation in World Trade Organization and regional trade agreements, they show, until 2016, they show that a trend towards more integration. So that is to be contrasted with what has happened post-2016. So this is the new policy environment. So this is the percentage of imports that's covered by tariffs. It's still a very small one. So this is for the United States, about 12% as of 2018. By now, it's actually higher. China, Mexico, and the EU. You may think this is still a very low percentage, but what's important is that it has risen relative to what it was 5 years ago. and it's also accompanied by certain rhetoric that makes the future of trade very uncertain. Another telling graph is this one. So it shows how many new trade agreements were formed in recent years. And by 2018, this number had dropped dramatically. This is partly due to the fact that there is enormous uncertainty regarding the future of trade relations. So the world is becoming much more closed, in my view, and this is something that I would not have said about a year ago when trade tensions first arose. My view was that perhaps this was just talk and negotiation, but we had to wait and see what happens. But I think after 2 years of seeing what has happened across the world, I do think we are in a new regime where trade tensions are going to be the new normal. So this is on the trade side, on the policy side. So I think in such an environment, if you are a developing country, if you're a developing country that has not yet benefited from trade with the US or Europe, if you are a small country in Africa, if you are Kenya, or if you are Ghana, I don't think you can be sure that you can apply the same model of export-led industrialization that applied to China. I don't think you can bet on this for your future growth. An additional challenge is that many countries are confronted with new technologies, and there is a general fear that robots are going to make low-wage labor in developing countries redundant. So remember, one of the big advantages of developing countries has always been that they can offer the low-wage labor. If low-wage labor becomes less important because firms can rely on machines, then developing countries are going to lose this advantage they have had. That said, I have to say that so far we have not seen any evidence of this. So this is based actually on some work we did in the World Bank last year in the context of the World Development Report. And let me just show you this graph that contradicts what I just said, actually. So what this graph shows is that, and again, it's a correlation for the most part. On the horizontal axis, you have industries ordered according to their intensity of using robots. So for example, here the automobile industry uses robots very intensively, followed by rubber and plastics, metal, and so on. And so what we found is that those industries that use robots very intensively are actually the industries that also experience the fastest growth of imports from developing countries. And these imports are imports in intermediate products and parts. And essentially the story behind this is that by using robots, you increase productivity. And as firms become more productive and grow, they need more intermediate parts, more components, and this they still get from developing countries. So that's why I said this fear that robots will render trade with developing countries redundant has not materialized yet, but it's still a fear that remains in the horizon because so far robots have not been applied in developing countries themselves. So of course the problem becomes if in developing countries you can use robots to produce the parts and the components, then eventually jobs in these countries are going to be threatened as well. So we have not seen that yet, but it's still a fear that's out there. So that creates this need for the new vision that I spoke of. So this is something that one is immediately confronted with if one joins an organization like the World Bank these days. And again, to summarize the main point, there are two main challenges that countries face, so developing countries, poor countries face. One is there is this backlash against free trade in developed countries. To put it bluntly, many developed countries are closing their borders. So if you are a poor country, you cannot really count on your exports to be welcome in richer countries. And at the same time, there is a fear of automation that may render low-wage jobs redundant. And on top of that, I would say there is also a lot of competition among developing countries. So if you are, in Kenya and you try to get into the export market, or into the US export market, you face competition from Ethiopia, you face competition from Bangladesh, from Vietnam. It's a very competitive space at this point. So against this background, this old model of development, so what's the old model? Export-led industrialization. So what seems to have worked for China or Korea or Vietnam is questionable. And that raises the question, what is the alternative? So if this is not going to work, what is likely to work for countries? So let me, now come into some of the alternatives that are being proposed in the development world. So the first one is what people call leapfrogging into services. And the idea is there to leap directly from agriculture to the service sector, so bypassing this stage of manufacturing. So the problem with this is, so far I have not seen a rigorous theoretical framework, and by theoretical I don't necessarily mean many equations, but some conceptual framework that clarifies how exactly this is supposed to work. On the empirical side, there are many challenges if you think about how this model may work. So for one, services is a very broad and heterogeneous category. So when we talk about services, we talk about tourism, but we also talk about financial and business services. You may talk about driving a car or being a hairdresser, or you may talk about being a lawyer or an accountant. So it's a very heterogeneous category. In addition, so far there has been no evidence of leapfrogging in any country. And again, there I'm going to rely on the World Development Report of 2020, and that was actually one of the interesting takeaways from this report. And let me show you what this graph shows, because I think it's one of the most interesting graphs in this report. So what this graph shows is how fast countries grow once they once their sectors join global value chains. And they can join global value chains in various ways. So you can join by participating in what we call limited manufacturing. So limited manufacturing is producing products that require low skill and low wages. So like textiles, shoes, the kind of products that still, Vietnam or Ethiopia produce. Then, in blue, you can have countries participating by joining advanced manufacturing and services. And by advanced manufacturing, we mean cars, so automobiles, machinery, chemicals, so products that require a more educated labor force and more capital. And then, in purple, you have in red, you have innovative activities. And these are the kind of activities that the more advanced, the richest countries participate in. So this include any products or services that require a highly skilled labor force. And they also include mostly services. So they include mostly things like design and research and so on. So you can see, how fast countries grow once they join these global value chains in one of these forms. And so the fastest growth is seen when countries join through limited manufacturing. So that says that from the time they join in year 0, 20 years later, they have the per capita income, this is all per capita, has grown cumulatively by 57%. So this is a huge number. So this is essentially the story of Vietnam here. Then, if you're in blue, it shows what happens if you join through advanced manufacturing. And again, you grow very fast, but a little at a lower pace by 48%. And in the last case, you grow by the 32%. And again, this is what you would expect, because countries who join here, the red part, these are countries that are already rich. So it's harder to, as you become richer and richer, it's harder to grow fast. So it makes sense that these numbers are lower. And another thing to point out about this graph is countries can be present in all the three graphs. Why? Because they may move from one to another. So for example, one example is Korea. South Korea started here in the green part and eventually moved to the blue part by participating in more advanced manufacturing, cars and so on. And by now it's in the red part. Okay, so countries transition across the three parts. So when I show this graph, many people ask immediately the question, so do we see countries leapfrogging? So go directly from being an agricultural country, leapfrogging directly to the red part. And this is, if you're in the World Bank, for many people, this is the vision for the future, that you're in Africa, you're Kenya or you're Ethiopia, and rather than industrializing and getting to the green part, you are going to jump right into the red part, right? And the fact is that we don't have a single case, a single country where we've seen that in the past. So, of course, the fact that it hasn't happened in the past doesn't mean it cannot happen in the future. But the fact is we've never seen it. So the most successful example is Korea, and Korea spent, again, time in all three parts, but it spent very little time on the green part. So very few years in limited manufacturing, and eventually it jumped to advanced manufacturing. But we don't see in the data, we've never seen a case where a country managed to go directly from being an agricultural, an agrarian setting to going to being an advanced economy, specializing in services and innovative activities. I'm not, again, I don't want to say that this cannot happen, but we don't have any evidence and we don't have any theory to support this so far. The second, view that you often hear about is urbanization. And again, development has traditionally been, it has traditionally gone hand in hand with urbanization. And we do see increasing urbanization in many developing countries. So even in Africa, we see the emergence of big cities. However, again, the evidence here suggests that, again, to borrow a term from a paper by Golin, by Doug Golin, who was here, and Jedwab and Polrath, in many cases, what we see in Africa is urbanization without industrialization. And when we see that in cities in Africa, then we find that the emergence of these cities is not associated with any good development outcomes. So what they show in this paper by Golin et al. Is that these cities, they are large, but the poverty rates are still high, the education levels are high, and any measure you use, any traditional measure of development or well-being, by any measure, these cities are not doing very well. And one point they make in this paper is there is a difference between what they call consumption and production cities. And consumption cities are cities associated with higher poverty. Consumption cities are cities where there are a lot of services, but these are consumption services. So you have many hairdressers and drivers, and you have many people working in these professions that are classified as services, but they don't seem to be contributing to poverty reduction. And this is to be contrasted with the so-called production services that are associated with trade that tend to be associated with better development outcomes. So the point they make in this paper is that somehow in Africa, cities have not played this role of being engines of development, partly because they concentrate on these consumption services. So now I want to come to the third hypothesis, to the third view that I think deserves further exploration. And this relies to the following intuitive idea that if international trade is not going to be the engine of growth in the future simply because of the political reality, then perhaps the domestic market will be asked to play a more important role. And there, I would like to start with some casual observations. So one observation is that India has been growing fast. We don't know how fast because of all the issues with the data. No one knows exactly what the numbers are. But the one thing that I think it's safe to say is that growth in India has not been driven by trade for sure. Now, India is a very large country, so it's a country where the large domestic market could potentially support growth. Why? Because a large economy can support internal economies of scale. A counterexample is Nigeria. So Nigeria is also a large country, not as large as India, but it's a large country, is very rich in natural resources. It's rich in people, it has a large population, and it has had periods of fast growth, mainly when oil prices go up, but there has been no sustained development and no poverty reduction. And so if you contrast these examples, one striking difference between the two is that is the degree of inequality. And this is not to say that India is an equal economy, not at all. But Nigeria is well known for the high degree of inequality. So essentially wealth is concentrated in the hands of very few. And so when there is a positive shock, for example, high oil prices that translate to fast aggregate growth, this growth never trickles down, or it trickles down in the form that Golin and Toll describe. So you have some rich, you have a very small rich class. They become richer because oil prices are high. They build nice homes. They need construction workers. They need drivers. They need hairdressers. They need housekeepers. These services increase. These are consumption services. So you have aggregate growth, but you don't have sustained poverty reduction, right? So in this, so that leads to this additional hypothesis that perhaps this high inequality is actually a constraint to growth and poverty reduction. And you know, cases like Nigeria or Angola are cases where that exemplify this story. So, you know, I try to explain this story using one or two examples, but of course these are one or two examples. And so one question is how do we operationalize this idea? And what exactly does it mean to say we have a large market, and what's the meaning of equality in this context? You know, how equal is unequal? What exactly is development? And how large does a market need to be in order for these mechanisms to be relevant? And last but not least, so I gave the example of India, but if a country is not India, if a country is small, what are you supposed to do? This is not going to be, you know, I'm not going to make the case here for countries trying to expand through war to create Lebensraum, not at all. So, but my point is that one needs a conceptual framework to think about these issues, and that actually brings me to some work, to a paper I've been working on recently, and that perhaps is, you know, a good way to structure this talk in the sense that I'm transitioning from in the talk, like myself, from what I've done in the World Bank to more academic work, and you know, I just want to give you an idea so far of what the motivation for this academic work was. So this is, by the way, this is a joint project with Tristan Reed, who's here. He's at the World Bank, and we have a preliminary draft out. And you know, the idea behind this paper is inspired by an old paper by Murphy, Schleifer, and Vishny from '89. That's actually a paper that makes the case for the importance of the domestic market and a certain degree of equality. And so this is not their famous paper on the big push in the JP. This is an earlier paper. And that paper itself formalized some of the ideas that have been in development for a very long time before. So most importantly, by Arthur Lewis, but also, you know, by Gustav Branisker and other people. And I don't want to try to cover all of them because I'm sure I will forget many. But the point is that these ideas were out in development for a very long time, and the paper by Murphy and Toll actually formalized these ideas. And you know, this paper gives rise to an empirical threshold crossing model that we estimate using a methodology very much in the spirit of Bresnahan and Risi's other famous paper in the JP, the entry paper. So we estimate this model using panel data from multiple countries, and we use it to calculate, you know, among various other things, how large a market needs to be in order to rely on itself, you know, to benefit from domestic economies of scale without relying on trade. So let me, you know, in the remaining time, which is not much, let me outline what this theoretical framework looks like. I'm not going to show any equations here, but I'll give you, you know, the general idea. It's a highly stylized model, but I just want to convey the main idea. So imagine you have a closed economy, and this can be relaxed, but the closed economy case is here relevant because I want to focus precisely on the case where trade is not important anymore. Imagine you have two sectors, agriculture and manufacturing. What do the preferences look like? There is an agricultural good, food, and this is a necessity. The consumers spend all their income on food until they receive a minimal subsistence level. This is called Z. For income levels above Z, consumers can afford to buy manufacturers. It's assumed that there is a well-defined ordering of goods in terms of desirability. So once you're above the subsistence level, you start buying some goods, and then as you become richer, you buy goods of higher desirability. And so as consumption increases, what in this model, in this highly stylized model, what increases is not the quantity of the goods you consumed. What increases is the variety of goods you consume, the range of goods. In terms of technology, there are two inputs, land and labor. Land is the fixed factor, so as a result, there are decreasing returns to scale in agriculture. And then in manufacturing, and that's important, there are two technologies. There is a constant returns to scale technology that has no fixed costs. And there is also an increasing returns to scale technology that has fixed costs but lower variable costs. So firms have a choice. They can, if they want to produce manufactured goods, they can produce using the constant returns to scale technology, or they can use the IRS, the increasing returns to scale technology. And industrialization in this setup is defined as the transition from the constant returns to scale to the IRS technology. Okay? The market structure is as follows. In agriculture, you have perfect competition. In manufacturing, if you produce with a backstop technology, there is perfect competition. But if you are in manufacturing and you produce with the IRS technology, so if you are industrialized, then there are monopoly. There is a monopoly and there are monopoly rents. And the monopoly rents actually play an important role in this model. And finally, and that's important, and that's the appealing feature of this model, it's assumed that there is poverty and inequality to start with. Poverty here is defined as follows. The wage, there is only one wage in the economy. The wage in agriculture is the same as in manufacturing. And this wage is below the subsistence level. So if all you do is being a worker in agriculture, then you cannot buy manufacturers and you're poor. You don't have enough to eat. On the other hand, and there is also a very high degree of inequality in the sense that most people are laborers, so they rely only on their labor income and they're poor. However, there is also a fraction in this population that owns land rents and shares. And so this is, the structure. And then what they show is that with these assumptions, you can have an equilibrium. It's actually a unique equilibrium with industrialization. And in this equilibrium, you have the monopolists. They show that the monopolists will adopt the IRS technology when the variable costs, when the profits are positive. And that means that the variable profits are high enough to cover the fixed costs. So in the marginal sector of the economy, the variable profits are going to be exactly equal to the fixed costs. So this is exactly what gives rise to this break-even condition. And for those of you familiar with the model, you see now why I said this is very similar to the setup in Bresnahan and Rees. In Bresnahan and Rees, they estimate market threshold sizes for a duopolist to enter, for more firms to enter a market. Here we don't do that, but here we simply ask the question, how large does a market need to be for the monopolist to view this IRS technology as desirable? And so to switch from the CRS to the IRS technology. Now, variable profits themselves depend on sales. So sales have to be large enough to cover the fixed costs. So denote by N star the minimum efficient scale. Then the sales are going to depend on two things in this setup. They're going to depend on the size of the domestic market. And so that's why a large domestic market is going to help. But they also depend on the size of the middle class. And so now I introduce another term here, middle class. What's the middle class in this model? So middle class is the number of consumers who are not very poor, so they have enough money to buy manufacturers, but they are not so rich that they buy only a few luxury goods that you can actually produce with this backstop technology. So they're actually the consumers that have incomes between the subsistence level and between the minimum efficient scale. Okay? So in other words, what happens in this economy is if you're really poor, if you rely only on your wage that's below the subsistence level, then you just buy food, nothing else. If you have some shares in land, or in industry, with industrialization, then you can buy, you use your first Z units of your income to buy food. Once you've reached the subsistence level, you use the next income to buy industrialized goods, so goods that are produced at mass scale. And then, if you have even more money, if you are in the upper class, if you're truly rich, that's the upper class, then you buy food. You buy these goods that are mass produced, the goods that are also bought by the middle class, but you also buy the backstop, you also buy the luxury goods that are produced with a constant returns to scale technology. So I think this model has, in my view, it's very simple, very stylized, but it has a number of very attractive features because you can use it to explain what's happening in many developing countries. So if you think about Nigeria, the example I gave you before, so this is a case where the middle class is relatively small. So you get, you have resources, but you have the very poor buying just food, and then you have the very rich buying just luxury goods, so goods that you don't produce, they're not mass produced with IRS technology. And in these cases, you end up with these consumption services and growth that doesn't trickle down. So I think it very much, you can use that to explain what happens in many developing countries. Now, what are the implications for development? You can apply this model to tell a story about structural transformation that looks as follows. So a poor country, take again the example I gave you on Nigeria, needs an initial boost. So you need something that is going to create resources, a wealth effect. And this can be an increase in agricultural productivity. This is again something that the early development literature often emphasized, that you need agricultural productivity to increase, otherwise you don't have, you cannot have enough resources freed from agriculture to go to manufacturing. But alternatively, you can also have exports of natural resources. For example, in the case of Nigeria, you can have oil. And that's where the model becomes a little more, allows for a little openness, in the sense that in order to export oil, you need to be trading with another country. But here, trade, in that case, has a very specific function. It's not a case where you use trade to tap into foreign markets and exploit economies of scale. You just use trade to generate this initial wealth effect, to just bring revenue into the country, and this is the only function that these oil revenues have. Okay? So you have this wealth effect, and this wealth effect can jumpstart a process of structural transformation. How? So take the case of agricultural productivity increasing, then the wages rise, both because productivity increases and because there is more demand for labor in agriculture. Then the rents rise, and labor moves from agriculture to manufacturing. As manufacturing expands, agriculture shrinks. So this is the process of industrialization. And so the main insights of this model is that what you need for industrialization to happen is you need this initial boost. So this can be, as I said, agricultural productivity or initial growth in exports. You need to have a large domestic market. And you also need a certain degree of equality. And here, equality is interpreted in a very specific way. What you need is a middle class. You need people with enough purchasing power that are going to support producing products at mass scale and taking into account and taking advantage of increasing returns to scale. Okay, so one question you may have is, here industrialization and development are synonyms in this model, and one question is, why does this lead to poverty reduction, which is what I'm interested in. So directly there is an effect, because in the model wages increase, and as wages increase, eventually the living standards of the poor improve, and they may rise above poverty. In addition, profits increase, and so the living standards of the small shareholders, to the extent that the small shareholders may be below the poverty line, also improve. But there are also regions that are outside the model. So for example, there may be technological spillovers associated with industrialization. So these are not in the model, but in other literature they've been shown to be very important for growth. And empirically, industrialization has always been associated with development. So you can rely also on this empirical observation. So this is sort of the theoretical background of the model. And so this theory structure leads to a threshold crossing model that looks as follows. And that's again, very simple. The profits in the increasing return to sector are given as follows. They're the market size times per capita variable profits. So these are the variable profits minus fixed costs. So following again, that's the part that's inspired by Bresnahan and Rees. The beauty of Bresnahan and Rees is they could estimate an entry model without using data on prices, which are very hard to get. And of course, I know Steve is going to say this is a huge, a huge weakness of this literature, and I agree. But if you are trying to think about poverty here for 100 countries, this becomes an advantage because you can try to relay all these entities I talked about, variable profits or fixed costs to observables rather than to market observables rather than prices. So we model here market size as a function of observables, and similarly variable profits as a function of demand observables and cost, demand variables and cost variables, and same thing with fixed costs. And a firm is going to enter the IRS sector, so it's going to adopt this new technology if the variable profits exceed the fixed costs, and so that gives rise to this empirical model. So let me now come to the part that makes a direct connection to the empirics. As I said, we model all these things, variable profits or fixed costs, as functions of observables. And these observables are as follows. So in terms of market size, so we define market size as a function of the following variables. So the population of a country in terms of raw bodies, and in particular in this specification is how many people are people who don't have the purchasing power of the middle class. Then the market size also depends on the share of the middle class, and I will tell you in a moment how we define that. And in addition, we take into account the fact that if you actually take this model to the data, in reality, most countries are not closed, right? In the model I presented, we started with a stylized case of a closed economy, but actually most countries are open to trade. So then to take that into account, we define two measures of integration. One is based on summing up the populations of all countries with which a particular country is integrated with, and the other one is based on summing up all the incomes of the countries with which a country is integrated with. So that's actually, I think, one of the biggest contributions of this work, that the way we define integration. So in order to see which countries are integrated with others, we exploited information on participation in the World Trade Organization, in GATT, but also many regional trade agreements, and we relied on some work by other authors that actually went down all the regional trade agreements and wrote down the legal provisions in each case, in which case there were legal provisions that connected countries. So if there is a legal provision connecting two countries, then we assign an indicator equal to 1, and then we use that to form weights summing up all the countries. So the main, I will try to avoid getting into the details given time constraints, but the main point I want to make here is that we end up using two different measures of international integration, and one is based on the idea that when you connect with other countries, you may connect with other countries that are very large in population, so this way you get access to a lot of consumers, but there's also an alternative measure that relies on the notion that you connect with countries that may be very rich, they may have high income, and this is also valuable because you may connect to countries that are small in terms of population, but they have large purchasing power. So in terms of the per capita variable profits, there again, the choice of variables is very much informed by the model in the sense that we use past export growth and also past agricultural productivity growth as observables that may lead to higher variable profits. And finally, when it comes to the fixed costs, that's when we rely on the very large literature on institutions in developing countries, which suggest that variables such as the tropical climate, the desert climate, distance to the coast, ruggedness, and also legal origins, whether they are British legal origins or French legal origins, have an impact to how well a country is run, which in turn may have effects on the size of the fixed costs. So these are the observables we use, and again, you can think of many robustness checks and many alternative definitions. The dependent variable we use in this work is sustained poverty reduction. And so this is, so in other words, the question we're asking is, can we relay sustained poverty reduction to industrialization? And if so, how large does a market need to be for this process to be relevant? So in order to do that, we need to define what sustained poverty reduction is. And without, again, going into the details, I'll just give you a brief overview. We use the PovCalNet. This is a computational tool developed by the World Bank that allows you to compute poverty rates for many different countries. We use that to compute poverty rates for particular years. And then in some cases, we have to interpolate given missing data. And then we break up our data into 5-year periods. And then we look at whether poverty has declined in every single year in this 5-year period. So if poverty has declined in every year in 5-year period, then for this period, we assign a variable equal to 1 to saying that during that period, we had sustained poverty reduction, right? If poverty declines in the first 2 years and then goes up in the next year, then we assign a value equal to 0 to this measure of sustained poverty reduction. So in other words, what we try to do, and again, there are many different ways to do that, but one has to start somewhere, is to say, do we see countries reducing poverty over a period of time every single year? And if so, then we call that sustained poverty reduction. Okay, so this is going to be our dependent variable. So let me show you, some patterns in the data that I think quite interesting. So we have a total of 93 countries. So we exclude countries that have already eliminated poverty. So these are the advanced countries, or all countries that have poverty rates below 3%. And again, poverty is defined in terms of extreme poverty, so being below the 1.9 threshold. And what this table shows you is how sustained real per capita GDP growth relates to sustained extreme poverty reduction. So what we did for poverty, you can also do for growth, for per capita income growth. You can take per capita income growth and see if there is growth every single period, then you will call it sustained per capita income growth. So as you would expect, growth and poverty reduction are highly correlated. And this is a point that people have often made. Growth is important for poverty. This is undeniable. So 76%, if we see poverty reduction in 76% of the cases, this is also accompanied by growth. However, there are also many cases, so 82 in particular, out of the 347, where you do have growth, but you don't see poverty reduction. So growth doesn't automatically generate poverty reduction. And we see these are all cases in countries that are extremely unequal. So again, Nigeria comes to mind. These are cases where you may have very fast growth, usually fueled by commodity prices, but then this growth never trickles down. And so this is the first thing to show. The second is, again, showing the data on sustained extreme poverty reduction. So here, what we graphed is how many cases of sustained poverty reduction do you have over time in various parts of the world. And the first thing that jumps out if you look at this graph is how high the percentages associated with sustained poverty reduction are. So most of the numbers are well above 50%. So here, for many countries, in 86% of these country 5-year pairs, you see sustained poverty reduction. And again, this speaks to the fact that there has been enormous progress made. So we do see poverty reduction over time. Our data, by the way, are from 1980 to 2015. There are some other things that I think are quite interesting. If you look at the period 2006 to 2010, so this is post-financial crisis, this is still a period where poverty goes down very fast in many parts of the world. And that again shows that advanced countries and developing countries are not always synchronized. So even though the advanced countries, the industrialized world was in a major crisis, there was still progress made in many developing countries. Some cases that really stand out is Africa. Again, sub-Saharan Africa, until 96, you have hardly any poverty reduction. And again, this is well known. Another case is Latin America, which is more puzzling. And we think that has more to do with the data. Let me also show you some patterns on international integration that I think are quite interesting. As I mentioned, there are two measures of international integration. One captures the size of the international market, the integrated market, as measured by population, and the other one as measured by income, and by relative income. And so what we do here is actually we construct a variable that measures integration in relative terms. So what's the size of the market in terms of population that you connect with relative to your own market? These are all in relative terms. So one thing you see is starting in 2000, around 2000, in almost the entire world, the integrated market jumps up, right? So in terms of population, countries are connecting to much larger markets. So what's going on here is very, very simply, this is China, right? You connect to China, you connect to a very larger market, but at the same time, see what happens. If you define this integration measure in terms of income, then it goes down. And again, that's a graphical way of portraying the entry of China. This is another way to see that very clearly. So it's again in 2001. This is just for countries that are members of the World Trade Organization. So in 2001, in terms of population, there is a jump. It seems that countries are connecting. The relative integrated market in terms of population becomes much larger than before because China enters the World Trade Organization. But in terms of income, you have this huge jump. But then the income in China rises. And so then, again, the relative income rises. So this is, one way of portraying what has happened. But at the same time, you can also see what the concern is. So if you're a developing country and you connect with China, all of a sudden you are connecting with a competitor rather than a country to which you can send your exports. So the reason I think this is important is I'll skip that, because there is no time left, but I'll tell you very briefly what eventually our empirical results show. The empirical results show that the market size is very important for explaining poverty reduction. And market size, as I said, is defined by three variables. So the population, the total population is important. International integration is important. And when we look at international integration, actually, what's most important is how rich the countries you connect with are. So, connecting to countries with higher relative income is much more valuable than connecting to countries with large populations. That's what the results suggest. So just, to give you some numbers, if you connect with a country that has the same relative population as you do, on average, it's like adding 160,000 people to your country. If you connect with a country that has the same relative income as you do, then it's like adding 20 million people to your population. So the income, the relative income, is much more important, and this has direct implications. So to give you an example, Kenya is a country that right now is considering, should we engage in a bilateral agreement with the United States, or shall we be focused more in a Pan-African trade agreement? And if you take these results, they suggest it's much more valuable for Kenya to connect to the United States, which is a rich economy, rather than relying on the African market. And again, this is not surprising. This is what Korea did, and this is what China did, and this is what the results of the model also say. Actually, in quantitative terms, they suggest huge effects. Now, of course, the problem is that it's not clear that all these countries can't connect to the United States anymore, right? So what we're saying is if you cannot connect to the United States, maybe the alternative is to connect to your neighbors that may not be as rich, but they have a very large population, and this is not as valuable, but it's still valuable compared to the alternative of being completely closed. So you can take these results as giving you some sense of how important regional integration may be in that setting. But finally, and I want to stop with that because this is more in the spirit of Kuznets. Finally, we consider one counterfactual, which is the strongest one, where we say, suppose there is no integration at all. So not only can't you connect with the United States, but you cannot even connect with your neighbors. And this is not so far-fetched because many developing countries view the neighbors as big competitors, so they're not willing to engage in trade cooperation. And so if you just rely on the domestic market, how large does this domestic market have to be so that you can have sustained poverty reduction? Okay? And so the number we get out of the model, this is the threshold, is 328 million. So these are 328 million in raw bodies. So people that are below the middle class. Okay, so think of those as being 328 million poor people. So the only country that meets this criterion is India, right? There is no one else, and this is, something that actually the graph shows. Now, the reason this is not so bleak is, if you don't have 328 million raw bodies, you can still meet this threshold by having a middle class, by increasing the purchasing power of the people within your country. So this is one way of transforming, a raw body to someone who can actually consume more. And so, again, to give you a specific example, take the case of Norway. Norway found oil in the late 1960s. At that point already, Norway was a fairly equal society. It's a very small country. It's not a country that has relied on trade to grow, but it's a country. It's not a country that has a very large domestic market. It's not a country that has a very large population, but it's a country that has always had a very high degree of equality. So I forget what the exact population of Norway is. It's certainly not 300 million, but if you actually, according to our estimates, if you go from 0% middle class to 100% middle class in the average country, this is like adding 540 million people. So if your middle class increases by 10%, then it's like adding 54 poor people in the country. So ultimately, what this suggests is that if we end up in a world where we have much less trade and much less regional integration, so open trade is still going to be the first choice. It's extremely important for developing countries. And the smaller the country, the more important it is. But if that's not an option, if you have to rely more on the domestic market, what are the options? Not to have war in order to raise, to enlarge your country. You may argue, some might argue, you may want higher fertility to increase your population. This would be a very, a perverse way to justify all these. Some countries have these policies that try to actually increase population. Tanzania is one example where there is a very strong policy where the current head of the state is encouraging people to have more kids. But of course, this creates all kinds of other problems. So if you're not going to advocate any of these, then an alternative is to try to create a more equal society with larger middle class, because by adding middle class, you add purchasing power. And again, this is not something new here. Many people have made the point before that the middle class may be important. But here, using this framework, we can actually quantify how important this is. And finally, how do you create a middle class? So again, in this model that we have, there is a very direct mapping between the theoretical structure and the policy implication, which is the way you create it, is to a certain extent by taxing income, but more importantly, by a more equitable distribution of shares. So it actually, it's an argument in favor of wealth redistribution more than income redistribution. And I will stop here, but I want to make sure that this last comment is not interpreted as advocacy for the wealth tax. I want to make clear that this is an argument that I think may be very relevant in very poor countries, countries like Angola or Nigeria, where you have a very large share of the population owning next to nothing. And in these countries, a certain degree of redistribution from the rich to the middle class, but also to the poor, may ultimately be a precondition for growth rather than an impediment to growth. So I will stop here and thank you very much for your patience.
So we are a bit short of time, but we'll take a couple of questions. I'll leave it to Penny to let everyone know has a mic to go around.
Thank you very much for this diverse and insightful lecture. I have two questions, but feel free to shorten if you want to take more. One is that in the beginning you said trade helped growth in Asia very much, but not so much in sub-Saharan Africa. And I was interested in what you think are the most convincing explanations for that phenomenon. And secondly, when we argue that we should invest in a global middle class, how do you think will that might that be an issue with current debates on the limits to that sort of consumption globally with regards to environmental concerns?
Should I take? I'll take three questions, and then there was someone.
Welcome back. Thank you for being with us. I just had a question. We were speaking about elephant curves, dragon curves, more inequality. But also there's been very much lower confidence in the Bretton Woods institutions. And my question is referring to the Anderson et al. Paper, which was published on the World Bank website 10 days ago, and speaking about this whole idea of foreign aid capture. My question to you is what do you think about that paper? I thought it was stunning that it showed all those correlations between World Bank dispersions and higher levels of offshore capital accounts by like 7.5%. What's your view towards that? I also totally understand that if your hand is tied for the next 72 hours. Thank you.
Third. Okay, so let me answer these questions if there are more. So regarding the role of trade, Africa has not traded much with the rest of the world the way East Asia had. So it's not that trade did not help Africa, it's that trade has not happened in Africa the way it has happened in East Asia. To the extent that trade has been present in Africa, for the most part, it has been in the form of commodity exports. And I think that is the story there is very consistent with the one I just presented, namely, you have commodity exports, they generate export revenue, but the growth these export revenues create never trickles down, and it doesn't trickle down because it stays in the hands of very few. That's certainly the story that you hear for Nigeria or Angola, but many other countries, that it's not growth that trickles down. In Asia, it was a very different story, where trade not only took advantage of the low-wage labor in China or Korea or Taiwan, and they, of course, also took advantage of the rich markets in the United States and Europe. But in addition to that, the resources they amassed through trade, through exports, were invested very differently in these countries. They were invested to fund infrastructure, substantial physical infrastructure, but also human capital infrastructure. So they did make these investments that were very important for growth and ultimately poverty reduction. So the developing experiences in the two parts of the world were very, very different. I'm sorry, the second question was on consumption. That's a good question. I mean, so I'll tell you my view. So when one talks about trade these days, and especially trade as it relates to the middle class and the consumption of the middle class, there's immediately pushback, because if developing countries grow the same way that developed countries have grown in the past, this is going to put a lot of pressure on the environment, and that's for sure. Two thoughts on this. First, if you actually look at where most of the pollution is, it's concentrated on some very large developing countries, mostly China and India. So one could gain a lot, one could make great progress in addressing these issues just by focusing on these two countries. And China is by no means, it's not a developed country, but it's by no means a poor country that cannot make a serious effort in addressing these issues. I think when it comes to countries in sub-Saharan Africa, so countries like, still Kenya or Ethiopia or Mali or Chad, countries where the poverty rates are extremely high still, where you have 30% of the population living under the poverty rate, or when you have a country like Niger, where you have the median age of the population is 15 years. Imagine what this means. Then in my view, climate change is not a priority in these countries. So when you go there and you say, developing a middle class or growth or trade, it's not that important. You should have second thoughts about all this because it's bad for the environment. I mean, not only do I think this is not effective, I think it's immoral for us to be saying that to these countries when we don't do our part. So I think we should start, with of course, the advanced economies, and to the extent that you go to developing countries, China and India, before we go to sub-Saharan Africa and talk about climate change there. Regarding the elite capture paper, so I don't want to talk about this paper simply because this is not the topic of the Kuznets Lecture. I mean, institutions are important for development, that's for sure. And in the framework I just showed you, institutions are indirectly measured by the fixed costs. And we do find that they play a very important role in development. I mean, one issue that not just the World Bank, the development community has always faced is when it comes to development, everyone always says institutions are important. You cannot make progress unless you fix the institutions. But no one has a recipe on how to fix institutions. What is the right policy? How do you do better? I think what research has shown, and that's perhaps the only constructive insight in that regard, is the only thing that helps is transparency. And I do think that the World Bank should follow the same policies. It advises other countries to follow, namely be completely transparent. Regarding this paper, I mean, I'll just make one comment. If you actually look at the aid affected by all this, it's a very small percentage. It's 7%. So, whatever the paper is, I don't think it speaks to a big issue in development. So.
Okay. So let's join us in thanking Penny, and please join us.